This is a video on a WoW player's perspective on Final Fantasy XIV. I've been a WoW player since vanilla, and have played every expansion to some degree. This is not a WoW bashing video. I like WoW and will be playing Shadowlands. That being said, I've done everything I wanted to do in BFA, so I've spent the last few months trying out Final Fantasy XIV. And after getting to max level and doing some in-game content, I wanted to talk about my thoughts on the game. Let's open up with gameplay. It's similar, but different. The basic controls are pretty much identical. Most people say the gameplay is slower, and it absolutely is slower in the beginning and for a while. But once you get to higher levels, I say it feels faster than WoW. You see, the game has a 2.5 second global cooldown, which means in the beginning, when you only have a few abilities, you feel like you're just waiting around. But later, you get a lot of off global cooldown abilities to fill in the blanks. While I'm still fairly new to the game, the rotations seem harder than WoW, or at least harder to optimize depending on your class. Some are obviously easier than others, like Red Mage or Dancer feel pretty easy, while a Black Mage or Summoner feel almost impossible to do perfectly while in the middle of a fight. For example, here's my Black Mage on a target dummy. Now I'm not going to go into too many specifics or, a proper opener that are actually very strict in how to execute them. But the basic idea behind the Black Mage is there's a fire phase and an ice phase. And the fire phase, you do a lot of damage really fast, but you also burn through your mana really fast. And then you shift to an ice phase where you don't do as much damage, but you recover your mana. And along the way, you're trying to keep up a dot, and there's different procs and different timers that you have to keep up with, and any kind of movement threatens to ruin all of that. But when you bring it all together, it turns out to be a really satisfying way to play the game, considering you're not only trying to optimize this complex rotation, but you're also doing that while doing the mechanics of a fight. And not to mention, it is very aesthetically pleasing, as you can see. On the face of it, this rotation isn't that bad on a target dummy, but that brings me to the encounter design, which is totally different from WoW. In WoW, the bosses usually have like 2 or 3 things you gotta watch out for. Tanks and healers have their things to worry about and you got yours, but in Final Fantasy XIV, everybody has to know how to deal with a lot of things the entire fight. I think it'll be best to show you rather than tell. Here's footage of the first fight in the current raid tier on Savage difficulty. There's plenty of bosses in WoW where I feel like it's a target dummy, that I might sometimes have to do something else. As you can see from the footage, there's a ton of shit going on that everyone has to deal with, or they die. Now I will admit that like 90% of how you deal with this stuff is just knowing where to stand and when. But it feels good. It kind of reminds me of old school Mega Man, but in MMO form. And what I mean by that is the bosses have set things they do in a particular order, and knowing how to dodge it is the game while also doing damage. So you got these classes with what I'm going to say difficult rotations for the most part, while also dodging all this craziness and trying to do both of those well simultaneously, and you get a really fun boss fight. I've only beaten one Savage fight in the current tier, and I've gotten a little practice on another, but so far I find the raid encounters in 14 to be a lot more engaging than WoW. I think WoW probably has more variety in mechanics, maybe, but the design in Final Fantasy XIV keeps me focusing every second. And due to the complexity of my class, I'm constantly trying to perform better and make fewer mistakes, while I'm also learning the mechanics of the raid encounter. Since we're talking about gameplay, I'll mention briefly how classes work in Final Fantasy XIV. Something that I really love more than I thought I would is that your single character can be any or all classes, including professions. The way that works is you start as one class, but let's say you want to try out a different one. So you go to the class trainer for whichever one you want to try, and poof, you can switch to that class at any time by just changing your weapon. Now the classes all have their own levels, so you still have to level up each one individually, which sounds just like leveling up alts in WoW, except we still have all the other stuff we have on our character. We still have our chocobo, our teleport system, we have flying in some zones, and not to mention any professions you've already started. It also makes me really attached to that one character. So far I've been pleasantly surprised that each class feels different, but it's also really hard to tell anything about them until you've leveled them up to a pretty high level. My Black Mage feels like a whole new class at level 80 than it did at level 50. I got my Dark Knight to max level and decided I didn't really like its gameplay, so now I'm leveling a Paladin. And so far, it feels better to me, but I can't be sure until I get all of its abilities later on. The last thing I want to say about classes is, God, I love class quests. Every class has its own story to play through, and it just feels great having that variety and class representation. In WoW, we had class quests in Legion, and a few others like Warlock's Green Fire quests that Blizz said they're not gonna do anymore, because it takes production time. But they're just so good, and make leveling alts such a treat, they need to rethink that. Final Fantasy XIV has different class storylines we play through, which makes it a new adventure on every class. Some are great, like the Dark Knight story is amazing, while I actually didn't care for the Black Mage story, which kind of annoys me because I love the Black Mage so much. Let's talk leveling and story. And I put these two together because they're kind of the same thing in Final Fantasy XIV. Because all of the content in the game is unlocked through story. In WoW, you can level up in dungeons and not do a single quest until you're at current content and pick it up right there. In 14, you have to play through the story to do anything, really. And this is an important difference in game design. Final Fantasy XIV is a real Final Fantasy game. I grew up playing Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, and 10. All of those are very text-heavy, story-driven narratives that is a foundation to the series. Final Fantasy XIV is the same. In fact, 14 feels like a single-player game while you're doing the storyline. That makes the gameplay while leveling up sometimes, I'm gonna say, not good. But I also didn't mind it being not good because I was interested in the story or the characters. There's plenty of times when I had to go talk to one person and then go right back to town and talk to another person, and that was the gameplay. And there really wasn't a lot of kill quests, to be honest. Every once in a while we had a quest to go kill 3 monsters out in the world, and then it was back to town for more story to read through. So here's the deal. If you don't like JRPG story, then it's going to be really hard to get to the end game in Final Fantasy XIV. That being said, if you do like older Final Fantasy story-driven narratives, then you are going to love this game. We need to talk about music. I used to think that WoW had great music, and it does. But WoW does not use music to its full potential. Final Fantasy XIV uses music so amazingly well. In 14, the music is changing depending on narrative tones to pump us up or make us sad or silly. And then music in boss fights makes the experience so immersive. Here, let me show you this example of how this fight starts out with normal, kinda epic boss music, and then the phase shifts, and the music shifts to mark the phase in a wonderful way. You see, it's all epic fantasy, and then bam, J-pop in your face. And if you don't like that particular song, don't worry, because that's the only time it shows up. All of the other trials have completely different, unique music from all kinds of different genres. Ever done a dungeon to smooth jazz? Final Fantasy XIV has that, and it's wonderful. I don't want to make this video too long, and I could talk about it forever, so I'm just going to say some random thoughts or feelings here before I wrap it up. The outdoor world in 14 feels small and empty compared to WoW. Lack of variety or dense populations of anything makes it just feel that way. Cities, on the other hand, feel like cities and are done really well. The game is beautiful. Both the character and monster models are extremely detailed and fit together perfectly. Final Fantasy XIV is not intuitive. There's all kinds of systems on top of systems and currencies with no explanation on where to spend them and all that sort of stuff. I grinded out an old relic weapon, which is a super long and grindy quest chain to get an awesome looking weapon, and some steps just had me scratching my head at first until I looked it up online. Crafting in Final Fantasy XIV is a long, arduous, and sometimes needlessly complex journey to take, and even though I got all of the professions to max level, except for fishing, I'm not sure if I like it or not. Even at max level, there's a lot of hoops to jump through to make any good gear for yourself. My final thoughts? I love this game. I've liked Final Fantasy since I was 10 years old, and being able to play an MMO version has been great. It does a lot of things really well, so well that when it does something poorly, I don't really mind. I'm definitely going to play Shadowlands when it comes out, and I'm looking forward to that new expansion experience. But I'd also like to spend some more time in Final Fantasy XIV as well. So if all my rambling has described a fun time to you, then totally give Final Fantasy XIV a try. There's a free trial after all. Seriously though, I need a raid team.
Okay. Well, I'm
Gonna
gonna do it again.
Save me, Sloth.
I can do it.
By the way, if you look down at your camera angle, like, you just look all...
Oh, yeah, that's awesome. Oh, there's an orb coming.
I hate it. It hurt.
Awesome.
You're not gonna block that one.
That's so good.